Hello, everyone. Christ is risen. God bless. Okay. Just sharing the link in a few places. I'm a few minutes late, too, so I apologize for the delay. Let's see, I've sent it on email and on Facebook. Feel free to share this link on your Facebook if you think that anyone would be interested. But as I've said before, I'm not principally concerned with the number of viewers as much as I am just that we have a good discussion with God's help. And if even one soul is benefited, then glory to God. Christ is risen. God bless to everyone once again. And in a moment, we'll pray to begin. Hello, Nathan. I had the joy of seeing your family for a few days here this week. Went to visit them. All right. Also, I'm going to tell that we hadn't mentioned before on Vimeo, which is a video website similar to YouTube. You can find a documentary about the Hermitage of the Holy Cross Monastery in West Virginia. It's just been released. It's called New Men on Vimeo.com. If I can get an exact link for you, I'll send it to you here because save you a little bit of browsing. But I've just started to watch it with my family. It seems very good. It's a neat insight into the life at the monastery there, which I visited on 4 occasions. So while we wait for people to join us, I'm just going to search that link real quick and put it in the chat here on the video. Let's see. It's just being a bit... Okay, there we go. Let's see if I can share this. Okay, so here's the link. You do have to rent or purchase the video. Holy Cross in West Virginia. So, but here's the link to that. All right, we'll pray Christ is risen to begin, and then we'll have our reading from the Way of the Ascetics and discussion. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. Okay, it's been a little while. We didn't have our last 2 sessions, but last week because it was Holy Thursday, and Tuesday because, well, I was out of town, and we were, I hope, all celebrating the radiant resurrection of Christ our God. And it was a sad, a bright sorrow, let's say, for much of Holy Week, as is to be expected, but even more so just on the night of Pascha itself. It took some time for my heart to feel the joy of the feast, because I was without our parishioners. So many people were having to stay home that night. And yet God in his great mercy, I have heard from many, and I know from myself, that despite the separation and the sorrow of that, we were able to still have a joyful Pascha, and I pray that you did as well. And there was a sense that at midnight, with our procession around the church and our first chanting of Christ is risen, a true sense that Christ had arisen, and that this was occurring within our own hearts, especially as we pass through the tomb of our heart, we could say, in Holy Week, going with Christ. There was a real joy that accompanied the feast, which overcame any of the obstacles that we might have presented through our fears of the virus and our restrictions that were put in place due to it. None of that could keep could keep in the tomb that joy which comes with Christ and his rising. So now on chapter 7 of the Way of the Ascetics, we are now at on the transfer of love from the self to Christ. And I'll simply begin reading now. If we move out of ourself, whom do we encounter? Asks Bishop Theophan. He supplies the answer at once. We meet God and our neighbor. It is for this very reason that denying oneself is the stipulation, and the chief one, for the person who seeks salvation in Christ. Only so can the center of our being be moved from self to Christ, who is both God and our neighbor. This means that all the care, concern, and love that we now lavish on ourselves is then quite naturally and without our noticing it transferred to God and thereby to our fellow men. Only so is the left hand kept from knowing what thy right hand doeth, and your alms are actually given in secret. Matthew 6, 3-4. Until this has come to pass, we cannot be filled with all knowledge, able also to admonish one another, Romans 15:14, in a real, non-material way. Our attempts along this line must be false because they are our own and spring from our will to please ourselves. It is especially necessary to understand this, for otherwise we become easily confused on the road of specious helpfulness and smug well-meaning that leads inevitably to the swamp of self-satisfaction. Refrain from busying yourself, therefore, with charity bazaars, sewing meetings. These are somewhat antiquated examples, but let's just say charitable activities and of any character. Refrain from busying yourself with them and other such occupations. Busyness over many things is in all forms chiefly a poison. Look within, examine yourself accurately, and you observe that many of these apparently self-giving deeds spring from a need to deafen your conscience, that is, from your uncontrollable habit of satisfying and pleasing yourself. Romans 15:1. No, the God of love and peace and complete sacrifice does not care to live in the midst of bustling and ado to please oneself, even if this is carried on perhaps under some kind of pretense. There is one way to make a test. If your peace of mind is troubled, if you become dejected or perhaps a little angry, if for some reason you have to give up performing the good deed you had planned, then you know that the spring was muddy. As an example, perhaps you give a gift to somebody and you wait with expectation for the joy on their face and for them to say, thank you so much, I'm so glad you got it, it's exactly what I wanted. They open the gift and they look a little disappointed or uninterested, and you feel some measure of anger or bitterness or dismay arising in your heart. And you think, how could they not be thankful for that? How could they not want it? How could they treat me that way after all I went to for them? You see that the spring was muddy. That if your real desire was to do what was best for them and to most beneficial and pleasing for them, and you recognize that maybe what you did wasn't what they truly needed or wanted, you wouldn't find the error in them, but in yourself. And you would even be able to let it go, to forgive it, and to find some new way to love them and to share with them your feelings toward them. Perhaps you ask why. Those who are experienced answer, external hindrance and opposition meet only the person who has not yielded his own will to God, and for God an obstacle is unthinkable. A truly unselfish act is not mine but God's. It cannot be obstructed. Only for my own plans, my own wishes, to study, to work, to rest, eat, or do a service to my fellow man, can some external circumstance get in the way, and then I'm grieved. But for the person who has found the narrow way that leads to life, that is, to God, there is only one conceivable hindrance, and that is his own sinful will. If he now wishes to do something, but is not permitted to carry it out, how can he grieve? For the rest, he is not making any plans. James 4:13-16. But this is another of the saints' secrets. Do not be deceived. A Christian ought himself also to walk even as he walked, 1 John 2:6, who did not seek his own will, John 5:30, but was born on straw, fasted 40 days, watched in prayer long nights through, healed the sick, drove out evil spirits, had no place to lay his head, and who finally let himself be spat upon, scourged, and crucified. Think how far you are from that. Ask yourself continually anew, Have I watched in prayer a single night? Have I fasted a single day? Have I driven out a single evil spirit? Have I unresistingly let myself be insulted and beaten? Have I truly crucified the flesh? Galatians 5:24, and not sought my own will. Keep all this freshly in mind. For what is denying oneself? He who truly denies himself does not ask, am I happy, or shall I be satisfied? All such questions fall away from you if you truly deny yourself, for by so doing you have also given up your will for either earthly or heavenly happiness. This obstinate will to personal happiness is the cause of unrest and division in your soul. Give it up and work against it. The rest will be given you without effort. Now, in this chapter, we hear again the denying oneself, the stipulation. It says the chief one for the person who seeks salvation in Christ, so only then can the center of our being be moved from self to Christ, who is both God and neighbor. And I would encourage you I would stress here, rather, that somebody told me a story about how they heard of people who had read this book, The Way of the Ascetics, and it had resulted really just in their being overly scrupulous and concerned always and anxious and fearful and really alienating themselves from others, from what it sounded like. And that is because they concerned themselves principally with denying themselves. I read to you recently from Elder Thaddeus about the strict can progress only to a certain point, that of physical abstinence. But it is necessary that we should have meekness, humility, and kindness in our relationships with our neighbors. So it isn't enough to not sin, but much more than that, we must go beyond the not sinning, which is the first obstacle to love. And from not sinning, we pass to virtue, to kindness, to love, to acts of charity and humility toward others. So when your heart begins to love, it will be comforted. And that's very important to know, that love will be accompanied by consolation, that what you sacrifice for God and for others will be returned to you, but not in the form that you gave it up. Like if you gave up, let's say, staying home for a few hours and relaxing on the couch in order to go help somebody, you don't do that for the sake of what you'll gain. You do it because Christ is in your neighbor, and out of love for Christ, you love your neighbor. And through that, your heart will feel a sense of fulfillment, that you fulfilled the purpose that God implanted within you, which is to sacrifice yourself out of love for others. That's our human purpose, truly. That's what it is to have a relationship with somebody that is genuine and loving and thoughtful. It is to sacrifice for the sake of the other. And when everyone does this, everyone is consoled, everyone feels cared about, everyone feels that the other loves them. And that is the greatest feeling. There is no greater feeling, let's say, for maybe a child than to sit in the arms of his mother or father and to feel that he is loved. And if it takes him falling off his bike and scraping his knee in order for him to feel once more that embrace, the embrace itself is more than ample consolation for the injury he sustained. Well, it's like this. Anytime we sustain some measure of self-injury to our ego or pride or comfort for the sake of others, for the sake of our Christ, the consolation we receive and the feeling of Christ being present in that moment and in that act of sacrifice and going with us and helping us to accomplish it, that sense overwhelms any sorrow or regret we feel, so that we look back on the suffering with gratitude, because through it we came to Christ. So I would strongly advise you once more, as I have before, don't read this book and think that it's your sole companion on your spiritual path. You're just going to pick up The Way of the Ascetics and do whatever it says in there. Stop drinking coffee or 2 cups of it. Stop going to this or that event or talking with this or that person. It isn't only through deprivation and abstinence that we will experience the grace of God. That's simply the log jam that's caught in the river, which is damming up the water of God's grace. We do have to remove the log jam. But when the grace of God begins to flow back through our hearts as it ought, then we will be inspired and strengthened to do the good and to seek the virtue and and show the love that we have been neglecting. And when we love, then we will be given consolation. And in this chapter, it also mentioned how we might grieve when we're trying to make a spiritual beginning and something prevents us. If we become angry about that or disturbed, it shows that the spring is muddy. It's an example of this would be St. Paisios, the Athonite, was once caught in a long conversation with a man who was suffering greatly. They began talking in the evening, and the conversation continued till about midnight, if I'm not mistaken. The man left the conversation much consoled and helped tremendously by the elder. But the elder, during all those hours passing by, had been suffering from the various ailments that he had, a great exhaustion he was feeling, and he had a desire to leave the conversation, but he persisted, thinking, how can I think only of myself when this poor man is suffering so grievously? So he forced himself to stay and listen. After the conversation was over, the man went off to a nearby monastery where he had a place to stay, but the elder had to finish his journey back to his cell through a high mountain trail, which was by the edge of a cliff. And at one point in the dark, being a moonless night, he slipped from the edge, and he landed in a tree growing from the side of the steep hill. And there, caught in the tree, and unable to free himself and not able to see even where he was to do it safely, he had a good thought. Instead of complaining against the man that kept him there or bemoaning his situation and how he had gotten into this predicament, he had a good thought. He said, well, since I'm trapped here and have nowhere to go, I should begin the evening prayers. He began to chant the evening prayers. And if I'm not mistaken, he said that as he began to chant the Holy God, his head, like a light bulb, suddenly click illumined. And he could see all around him to see where he was at. He was able to free himself and climb back up onto the path and go on his way. And you see how God consoled and helped his child, St. Paisios, who had sacrificed himself for his fellow man. Our experiences will not be perhaps so miraculous or so obvious to us, but there will accompany our sacrifice a sense of consolation. So again, just don't think that the point of the spiritual life is only to be unhappy or to be uncomfortable or to suffer, but it is through it, just as through the cross we encounter the empty tomb and the resurrection, through the cross of self-denial and abstinence, in consult with our spiritual father or father confessor, doing things that are appropriate for our spiritual level and strength. Through those things, we mount the cross, and we also are raised from the tomb. So keep that in mind as you read this book, and don't go off onto any extreme ascetic endeavors or self-denials without it being blessed by somebody, by a priest you trust, by a good counselor in the form of your father confessor. But I think it is obvious to all of us that I hope that you can remember in your own life that the times you've been most unhappy were when you were fixated upon your unhappiness, when you were grieving endlessly over the fact that you had been hurt or you had been betrayed or let down by somebody. And so if you remember how you felt in those moments, consider how you feel when from your heart you freely forgive, when from your heart you pray for the one who offended you, when you decide that it's more important to go on from the point of suffering and to continue to bear the cross and asking Christ's help with it. You'll find that if you compare the two experiences, you'll be much more at peace and consoled if you take the second path. Now, the elders of Optina had things to say about love for neighbor, and I'm going to read from those. Hello, Rebecca. Indeed, he is risen. God bless you. I'm glad you're joining us. But the elders of Optina speak about love for neighbor, and I'm just going to read a few selections. Again, this is from the book Living Without Hypocrisy. But it's very important for us to consider now, as we're denying ourselves, we need to transfer the love we were showing to ourselves to other people. Those people are in our household, they're at our workplace, they're in our neighborhood, they're in our parish. We've been loving ourselves too much, but we shouldn't let our love go to waste. It's not a matter of turning off the tap on love, which has been pouring itself onto our own soul, but we should be redirecting that water, that love toward other people whose soul may be parched and who may need that simple kindness and love that we have the potential to show them. So, love for neighbor, the elders of Optina say about this. You must bear the spiritual infirmities of your brother gladly and without annoyance. For when someone is physically ill, we are not only not annoyed with him, but we are exemplary in our care for him. We should also set an example in cases of spiritual illness. Another wise priest, and I may have quoted this before, would say, they don't say in the hospital, "Oh, you good-for-nothing woman, what's wrong with your leg, and why can't, or with your eyes, and why can't you see properly?" But instead, with compassion and care, they attend to the physical infirmity of the one in the hospital. And you should consider, the priest would say, that you live surrounded by ailing persons in your family life, in your life in general, and that as in the hospital, you should extend care to these poor souls. When they sin, it's only a sign of their spiritual infirmity. So focus on the tragedy and not the offense. Focus on the opportunity for compassion and not the opportunity for judgment when the sin happens, when the annoyance arises. It says, if you want to be spiritually tranquil, this is of St. Moses, all of these so far. If you want to be spiritually tranquil, never part from someone while feeling agitated, but try in every way to forgive everyone in your soul and to make peace as much as possible, so that you will part with each other in a peaceful spirit, and in this way you will enjoy spiritual peace. And we also hear from Christ on this theme, if you remember that your brother has something against you, that you should leave your gift before the altar and go your way and be reconciled to your brother. Well, the human heart is a temple of the Holy Spirit, the soul, and within there, on the altar of the heart, we offer praise and thanksgiving and prayer to God. And so it is at this altar also that we must leave the gift and go to be reconciled immediately. As soon as we recognize that we've hurt somebody, that we've offended them, it doesn't mean that we betray the truth, but if there was in us some failure to be loving, some failure to share the truth in a loving manner, or just some rank and outright evil on our part that we directed toward them, don't let the moment pass without rushing to ask the forgiveness of the other soul. You'll receive so much peace from this, and and as you experience that peace and that sense of the stone dropping from your heart, you'll want to run again and again to the act of forgiveness, and so that you can stop caring about the regret and the remorse you feel when you've left somebody in a bad state of mind, and you wonder whether it's possible even to go back to them after that sometimes. Just make a habit of asking forgiveness and revisiting those that you have already offended in the past. And that's an act of love. Now, we also read, to one who labors, God sends mercy, but to one who loves, consolation. St. Ambrose of Optina. If you will receive people for the sake of God, then be assured that all will be well with you. Also from St. Ambrose. Now, when we feel, but I don't have love, and I really struggle to show love, that's something we've all experienced. And they say this about that concern. Love, of course, is above everything. If you find that you have no love, but desire to have it, then perform works of love, although at first without love. The Lord will see your desire and your striving and will put love in your heart. But mainly, when you notice that you've sinned against love, immediately confess it to your elder. This can happen sometimes from a foolish heart and sometimes from the enemy. You yourself cannot discern this, but when you confess, the enemy will go away. So the frequent recognition of our lack of love and the confession of it is a very important part of being free from that lovelessness and being given a gift of love. So when we don't have love, we perform the deed of love nonetheless. If we don't feel we actually forgive somebody, but we could force ourselves to pray for them, that's an act of forgiveness. If we don't feel humble in our heart, and we think, well, if I'm not humble, I shouldn't approach them to ask their forgiveness because it's just hypocrisy. Better to be at least hypocritical, but striving to be humble, than to be hypocritical and not even attempting to be humble and to love. So we're all hypocrites, but it's just a matter of whether we're striving to overcome that state of things or whether we're just complacently accepting it. So fight against it. Above all, St. Macarius says, strive to love your neighbor, for in his love consists love for God. And St. Silouan the Athonite would say in a similar way, he would say that our life and death is with our neighbor. And that in the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, it's not just that he would interpret it not just to mean that in the way that I love myself and care for myself and am concerned for myself, I should be loving and caring and concerned for my neighbor. But he would say more than that, it's as if your own self, your true self, is to be found in the person of your neighbor, and that in that person you love yourself by the love you extend to them. So he's saying, begin with your neighbor. Put them at the very front. That's the person to love today, is your neighbor. And in loving our neighbor, St. Macarius is telling us we love God. For as St. John also, the apostle, says, if we have not loved our brother whom we have seen, how can we love God whom we have not seen? And so for many people, this is a difficult thing to begin, because the neighbor is the one who most of all offends us and disappoints us and betrays us and puts up the obstacles to our Christian strivings. That's how we see it. So it's much easier to say, I love God, than it is to truly say, with all sincerity, I love my neighbor. And in fact, it's easier at times to just retreat and leave our neighbor behind. Like, I don't want to deal with this right now. I want to go to a monastery and go for a visit. Or I want to just go into my room and go to my prayer corner and not deal with all these people and all these temptations. And so in saying that, we who are in the world and who have been entrusted with the souls of those around us, in saying that, we can very easily fail to love God and our neighbor at the same moment, so that our prayer will not, in fact, be powerful. It will be hindered by the lack of love we have for the neighbor. So now here's another concern, though. How can I love somebody when they don't even love me? I'm trying to be kind to them. I'm forgiving them and sacrificing for them, but they're not doing it for me. So how can I really love them? It's just too much to bear. Well, St. Macarius says, they do not love you. You love them. The fact that they do not love you does not depend on you, but your loving them is within your power and is your duty. For the Lord commanded, do not love just those who love you, but also your enemies. Matthew 5:44. But when there is no love in us, so much more must we humble ourselves, drive away pride, and pray about this to the Lord. The prayer should be specific. It may be you're coming home from work, and you know that when you walk in the front door, you're going to be just sort of burdened and annoyed by the flood of people rushing up to you. If you have children, this will happen. Your wife coming, your children coming up to you, asking you questions about your day, wanting to tell you about what's occurred. At least as a man, as a husband and father, I have this temptation in my heart. Like, I want to be left alone. I just want to go somewhere and be by myself. But at that moment, before walking into the house, we can entreat God, oh Lord, give me a gift of love for my dear family, because you see that now I don't have love for them and I would wish to separate myself, but give me a gift of love for them. Help me to be with them tonight. And the Lord will answer that prayer. You're going into work and you don't love your boss or your coworker. Lord, you see how I have judged my manager, my coworker, and how I have not loved them. And even now I wish to avoid them, but give me a gift of love for them. Help me to live with them in a Christian manner. With prayers like this, asking God's help, and then when the opportunity presents itself, making use of it, to pray even once for them, to engage them in a conversation with kindness, asking after them with real concern for their well-being. There's a number of ways to show love, even in simple ways. And we have to begin to do it even when we feel that it's not sincere, because God, who sees the labor, will give the blessing. God, who sees the farmer toiling in the field, will send the rain of his grace so that the crop can actually spring up. Now, that will be all for today. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share in the chat log there. And a very good book on love for others, and an example of it. Well, there's different ones, but Wounded by Love is a book by Saint Porphyrios of Mount Athos, Wounded by Love. He speaks a lot about this. And Saint Paisios the Athonite, or Saint Paisios of Mount Athos? Let me see the name of it. I have it here. Yes, okay. Saint Paisios of Mount Athos is the name of another book, which is a very good one to read about the sort of sacrificial love for neighbor that the saints have. It's very comforting too, because you see what joy and life and vigor and zeal the elder had because of his love for others. So that will encourage us to see that it'll be all right if I set out on this path. God will take care of me. So there's a few books you could consider reading. Anyway, it looks like we don't have any particular questions. I'll wait another minute. But I wish you all the radiant joy of the Paschal Feast. May the Lord enlighten and strengthen and comfort your heart in this time of hardship and separation that we're still passing through with this virus. But glory to God, it seems there's some very hopeful signs, both reductions in cases and deaths in some places, and also finding out that many people have in fact been ill with it or exposed, and so now have an immunity to it. That's also very good, hopeful news. So may God grant through the prayers of all his saints that this would continue, and that soon our full restoration of fellowship in the church would be accomplished. So, all right. Thank you all for joining me. And next week we'll be reading from chapter 8 of the Way of the Ascetics. And that chapter is called On Guarding Against the Reentry of Vanquished Evil. We'll now chant the Kontakion of the Paschal Feast. Thou didst descend into the tomb, O immortal. Thou didst destroy the power of death. In victory didst thou arise, O Christ God, proclaiming rejoice to the myrrh-bearing women, granting peace to thine apostles, and bestowing resurrection on the fallen. Christ is risen. Indeed, he is risen. God bless you all.